Hello, everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with Almost Erased. You know how this works by now. We dig up these stories, these events that seem to have been, well, almost erased from history. And then it's up to you, the listener, to decide, real or not. So let's get started. Creepy house. Welcome back, everyone. You know, I love digging into the more obscure corners of history. And lately, I've been spending a lot of time online, going down some pretty fascinating rabbit holes. I've come across some pretty wild stories, but this one is truly something else.
Oh.
It's about a soldier, Emil, the Great War, and a chilling event that happened years after the fighting ended.
Years after?
Yeah, like a decade later in a small European village. Really drives home the lasting impact of war. You know, the scars that remain long after the battles are over.
Yeah, absolutely. The ripple effects, not just on the individuals, but the whole community.
Exactly. But to really understand what happened, we need to go back to the beginning, before the war, before everything changed.
Okay, let's do that. Set the scene for me. What was Emil's life like before the war?
So picture this, a small village nestled in the countryside. Life moves at a slower pace. Emil was born there in the late 1800s, the eldest son of a wheelwright and a teacher.
A simple life.
But Emil, he wasn't just any village boy. He had a certain sensitivity, a way with words. He was a bit of a poet, actually.
A poet?
Yeah, he'd spend hours by the creek, writing verses about nature, filling up notebooks. He was known for his kindness, his gentle nature, really beloved by everyone in the village.
I can imagine it must have been a huge blow when the war came.
Oh, absolutely. When he was called up to serve in 1914, it was a big event for the village. People gathered to see him off, his fiancée Lena braiding rosemary into his hair for luck. You know, those little rituals people cling to in times of uncertainty.
Right. Rosemary for luck. Hope in the face of fear.
Exactly. And his early letters home, they're full of that kind of naive optimism you see a lot with soldiers at the start of a war. He writes about marching songs, camaraderie, the belief that they'll be home by Christmas.
That initial wave of enthusiasm and patriotic fervor, it's a common theme in many wartime narratives.
Sadly, that fades quickly. By 1916, the tone of his letters changes drastically. He talks about the mud of the Somme, how it has a voice, gargling when it rains. It's haunting imagery.
Wow. Haunting is right. That constant exposure to such bleak conditions, it starts to wear on you.
And it just gets darker. In 1917, after Passchendaele, he writes that he doesn't dream anymore, that he just sees the dead.
Chilling. Almost like the war is invading his mind, replacing dreams with nightmares.
Exactly. And then there's this one event, a turning point that seems to have completely shattered him. April 1918, near Ypres, a German gas attack. Emil and 5 of his comrades are trapped in a shell crater, engulfed in chlorine gas. Can you imagine the terror?
Oh, absolutely. Gas warfare is horrifying, both physically and mentally. The effects are devastating.
We actually have an account from another soldier, Private R, who managed to escape the crater. He describes a scene of complete chaos. He talks about this green fog burning their lungs and how Emil starts shouting about worms with teeth and flesh-eating monsters in the mud, clearly hallucinating from the gas and the trauma.
Oh, wow.
When the gas cleared, only Emil was alive. But his 5 comrades, they were all dead, each with bayonet wounds to the chest. Emil was just sitting there among them, still raving about flesh-eating monsters.
It's a horrifying image, and points to the profound psychological trauma he must have been experiencing. It's textbook PTSD.
And that's actually what he was diagnosed with, or at least the closest equivalent they had back then. Hysterical blindness, they called it. His medical records document persistent hallucinations, and his physician even noted that Emil insisted there were flesh-eating monsters everywhere, and that they're trying to eat him.
It's heartbreaking to be so tormented by your own mind. And given the limited understanding of mental health back then, I imagine treatment options were pretty scarce.
They were. Emil went through hydrotherapy, morphine-induced comas, all pretty ineffective and possibly even harmful in the long run. When he was finally discharged in March 1919, his paper said he was stable, but his doctor wrote a chilling note in the margin. Fragile remission.
Fragile remission? Ominous words, considering what's to come.
It wasn't the homecoming anyone had hoped for. They expected a tired, maybe a bit thin veteran. What they got was different. A twitching stranger avoiding eye contact, clinging to Lena, then recoiling, shouting that she'd grown scales. He even accused his own mother of sneaking into his room at night to taste his blood.
Oh, wow. It's like the war followed him home, took root in his mind. So tragic.
We can actually see how deeply it affected him in Maima's diary entries. She describes a picnic where he breaks down, weeping, saying, "Your skin keeps melting."
It's as if he can't distinguish between reality and these horrific hallucinations.
She begs him to see a doctor, but Emil's convinced the doctor is one of them, one of the monsters he keeps seeing. His paranoia, the delusions, it's like a wall between him and everyone who loves him.
A tragic illustration of how mental illness can isolate its victims, even from those closest to them. And this misunderstanding, well, it seems like it had some devastating consequences.
And that leads us to that fateful night in March 1919, just a few months after Emil came home, the night that would become known as the Night of the Birches.
That's the night everything changed, right? The night of the
massacre, yeah.
Right.
But it starts like any other day. The snow's melting, a hint of spring in the air. Emil even goes to mass that morning. It's almost peaceful, deceptive.
Yeah, like the calm before the storm.
By midnight, though, the village is in chaos. Screams, people running. It's a horrifying scene.
What happened? Paint me a picture. What did they find?
Well, investigators were able to piece together a timeline, and that's pretty chilling. Around 10 p.m., there were 3 gunshots from Emil's cottage.
Oh, God.
His brother, Jan, was found in the kitchen, a half-eaten loaf of bread on the table. It's such a normal detail, Makes the whole thing even more disturbing.
I see. The ordinary and the horrific. Just juxtaposed like that.
The wheel's mother, Magda, was found in the hallway, her apron pocket filled with chamomile, a folk remedy for nightmares.
Oh, wow. That's like she knew on some level and was trying to help him.
And then there's Lena, dead in the bedroom, clutching a wedding veil, the one she'd kept since 1914. Just a symbol of everything they lost,
It's heartbreaking.
But it gets worse. About half an hour later, Emil breaks into the Kovac family's home. The miller, his wife, their twin daughters, all murdered.
Oh my God, this is just senseless.
Then he attacks the blacksmith, Ludwig, and his wife, Obina, outside the bakery. Ludwig survives, but he has this awful scar across his shoulder. He said Emil was swinging an axe like a madman.
Like he didn't even recognize them.
When Irina hit Emil with a shovel, he just laughed. By 3 a.m., 30 villagers had him cornered in a birch grove, armed with whatever they could find. Scythes, pitchforks, lanterns. Can you imagine facing someone you knew? Someone who was once kind, and seeing that?
It must have been terrifying.
One of the villagers described finding Emil digging a trench, piling up stones like sandbags. Even in his madness, he was back in the trenches.
Like the war was all he knew anymore.
As dawn broke, he charged at them, screaming, "You all won't eat me!" It's not clear who struck him with a pitchfork. Mortally wounded him.
A tragic end. But you mentioned a moment of clarity, right? Just before he died.
Yeah, all the witnesses agree. Right before he died, the delirium, it just vanished.
What do you mean? Like he snapped out of it?
He touched the villager who'd struck him and asked if Lena was safe. And when they told him she wasn't, he seemed to understand. He was given last rites and died, apparently, peacefully.
Wow. A flicker of his old self right at the end. Tragic.
This horrific act. And then that moment of lucidity. It makes you think, doesn't it? About guilt, responsibility, the effects of trauma.
Absolutely. It's hard to even know what to make of that, Clearly, Emil was deeply affected by the war, and it manifested in this horrible way. But that moment of clarity, it reminds us that he was a victim too, a human being.
What about the village? How did they recover from something like that?
I imagine it wasn't easy.
It wasn't. It really wasn't. The village was never the same. Half the homes were abandoned, just left to rot. A constant reminder. And the people who stayed, they carried their own scars, visible and invisible. It really shows you the ripple effects of something like this, how one event can just fracture a whole community.
The hidden cost of war, right? The trauma that lingers long after the fighting is over.
Exactly. Lena's sister ended up emigrating to America, couldn't bear to stay. And a few years later, one of the other widows, she took her own life. And even Emil's doctor, he later wrote about how society of failed veterans like Emil said, "We sent these men home with their skulls full of ghosts. What did we expect?" Powerful words.
Yeah. Sadly, it's something we still struggle with today, isn't it? Providing adequate care for veterans struggling with PTSD and mental health issues. It's
true. And it brings us back to Emil's story. The only memorial to the victims is a simple cross in that birch grove. No names, just the years 1914, 1918. Put there by the priest, Father Andre.
A simple marker, but it speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Father Andre said something that really stuck with me. The war took more than our sons. It took our hersey. It makes you think about the true cost of war. It's not just about the battles. It's about the things that are broken and the people left behind.
Absolutely. The unseen wounds, the scars that run deep.
Could it have been different? Could Emil have been helped? Could the village have been spared? We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it. Emil's story reminds us that the wounds of war, they run deep. And sometimes they fester.
It highlights the importance of empathy and understanding, and providing proper care and support for veterans, making sure they get the help they need.
That's what I want you all to think about. What could have been done differently? How could society have better supported Emil and other veterans like him? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Let's talk about it in the comments. Stories like Emil's, they need to be heard, and the lessons we learned from them, well, they're more important now than ever.